Hey everybody, and welcome back to Mass Office Hours. Today is Wednesday, the 14th of February. You are watching us live on YouTube, maybe, or you're listening later on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to get your podcasts. We are excited for tonight's show, and of course, I feel like I kind of have to acknowledge the big holiday on everybody's mind. So Monday the 12th was Darwin Day. Mike, what did you do for Darwin Day?
On Monday the 12th, I woke up and I thought to myself, I better text Trex because it's Darwin Day. Mm-hmm. And it was really the first thing I had a reminder. I covered up all my son's homework on the fridge and I put a magnet with text Trex about Darwin Day. And that's what I did. And you know, obviously I wrote you right away, thought about it a lot and wanted to wish you well that day. So hopefully the fact that I remembered meant a lot to you.
It did, yeah. Now that I'm in a department of evolutionary anthropology, you can imagine my surprise when Monday I went into our mail room to check the mail, had some supplies coming in for a study, and I found a life-size cardboard cutout of Charles Darwin. We're doing our big celebration Friday night as a department. I have no idea what we have in store, but happy Darwin Day to everybody. And also, a lesser-known holiday tonight is Valentine's Day. At least in the United States. I don't know how, I don't think it's recognized abroad, but as of recording this, Mike and I are both happily married to lovely people. We'll see if that holds. I think doing this show tonight puts both of us in a precarious position in that regard. And I'm sure everyone listening live on YouTube is in a similar precarious position. So I want to thank everyone for risking the most important thing in their life to be with us live tonight.
Well, we all have each other. And that's what it's all about. I'd like to add one thing on Valentine's Day, which is that if you're wondering if second grade classrooms give out candy on Valentine's Day, the answer is an extraordinary amount. My son came home with no less than 4 bags.
What do you mean by candy? Bag? What are we talking about?
Like little paper bags, like maybe that big.
Okay.
Yeah, like
bigger
paper
than a
bags.
Sandwich bag. Yeah.
Yeah, like somebody clearly still had Halloween candy from however many months ago, and they all threw it in there, needed to get it out of their house. We gave Sonic the Hedgehog Valentines. You know, the little, like this big, you write the name, 2, and I thought that was a good way to go. But apparently 4 bags of candy that we will never eat. And now we have it. But that was school today. I said, did you do any work today, buddy? I said, no, just party. Okay.
Well, there you go. Your Florida tax dollars at work, getting a good Valentine's Day party.
There it is.
All right. If you like the show and you want to support us on this lovely holiday, there's a lot of ways you could do it. You could like, rate, subscribe, and review our show wherever you happen to get it. You could tell a friend, or better, share it with a friend. Send them a link to our YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast page, whatever you prefer. If you want to participate in the show, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can use the link in the description of this video to submit a question 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We are in that spreadsheet looking at those questions on a very regular basis. But of course, the best way to participate is to join us live on YouTube every Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You can join us live in the chat, ask the questions on your mind. And I think the most valuable thing about being live in the chat, aside from being able to see us and hear us and participate in current reality with us, is you can ask follow-up questions and you can kind of elaborate, and it becomes more like a conversation. So I definitely recommend, if you can, to join us live when it suits your schedule. Now, Mike, we have actual show to get into. So in last week's episode, Lauren and I got a question about something that is squarely within your wheelhouse. We were talking a little bit about cluster sets, and I kind of talked about the way I like to train when I'm either kind of bored or lacking focus or short on time. And it's not cluster sets, but it's a similar kind of thing, right? And so I basically am redistributing my rest. I'm doing these weird kind of mini sets with very short rest periods interspersed. And it kind of led into a question about how we put together all these different training strategies that fall under that general umbrella, where we're having kind of anything that's a departure, I would say, from the typical set, rest, set paradigm, where you're doing, a set of 10, you rest for 2 to 3 minutes, and then you do another. Or if you're a power lifter, you do a set of 3 to 5. You rest maybe 3 to 5 minutes, right? And then you do the next. All these different strategies, like cluster sets, like Myo-Reps, like rest redistribution sets, like supersets. We got a question about how we distinguish those, where we draw the lines between them, what they're for, and there are meaningful differences between them, and the definitions sometimes for someone like me or Lauren, who's not reviewing these studies on a regular basis en masse, the definitions can be a bit difficult to parse on the fly. So all of that is to say, you've prepared a lovely segment for us where you're going to talk through these different strategies. And, like I said, the distinctions between them are important, but, they're pretty nuanced. And so to facilitate your segment here, I have now covered up my face. I know viewers at home are going to be upset about that, but we've got kind of a visual aid here, a little outline to facilitate what you have to say. So the floor is officially yours, Mike.
Well, thank you, sir. And everybody enjoy this podcast. I'm going to string this out as long as possible. The longer I go here, the longer I'm the only one on the screen. It's more FaceTime for me, less FaceTime for you, although rest assured, Trex still looks perpetually cold in his hat and his, fleece there.
You're going to feel bad when we find out I have a thyroid problem, and that's why I feel cold all the time.
I can't remember. I saw a comment. I don't know, it was a YouTube comment. Somebody else said that last week on one of the episodes.
You're gonna feel bad.
And I was so excited. I was like, I've been saying this because I said this to you in one of our meetings like a year or two ago. So you're always looking perpetually cold. So yeah. I was very excited to see somebody else recognize that. So in terms of these programming strategies, take a step back for just a second. And I want to talk about some of the terminology that is used to introduce all of these collectively, because we've probably heard them referred to in a little bit different way. And so just so we're all on the same page up front, I call a lot of these programming strategies, you may hear a lot of these called time efficient strategies or advanced training techniques. I think advanced training techniques is some of the terminology that's gotten into the literature a bit. Now, collectively, I just refer to all of these, let's say, as programming strategies, because this is where we really have to delineate between an overarching theory of training or a model of periodization and then what I would call programming. So if we start there and we have an overall theory of training or a model of periodization, this is really talking about long-term trends, or you have this overarching model and then you fit programming into it. So if we take a model where over time we're going to decrease volume over the course of a macro cycle and increase intensity, that is your overarching model or periodization. Now, these programming strategies that we're going to talk about, it's important to understand your overall model, because then you're going to fit them into that model. Meaning, if we're going to utilize something that accumulates a lot of volume in a very short amount of time and causes a lot of fatigue, a powerlifter, for example, isn't going to be using this strategy 2 weeks out from a competition. That individual is going to be using this strategy earlier on in that model where they have higher volume, right? So I think that word programming is important here, because the periodization or the overall structure dictates what type of programming strategy you might use or what you might fit in there. With that said, there are specifically 6 programming strategies here that I want to talk about tonight, and you can see those up on your screen. So if we start right here where it says strategies to discuss, we're going to talk about rest pause, we're going to talk about Myo-Reps, rest redistribution sets, cluster sets, and supersets. Now, I put together this conceptual overview for each of these. So we see rest pause on page 1. After that, we'll go down to page 2 and look at Myo-Reps. What I want to do with each one is define what the terminology is, talk about when it's used, what it's trying to accomplish, give a specific example of how you can utilize it, and then how it could be practical for you. So kind of a conceptual overview. And I say this a lot in mass, and one thing I think is important before we get started on rest pause is that I wouldn't ever take anything, for the most part, to be you have to do it exactly this way. Rather, this is a concept, and then as long as you understand that concept, you can take and adapt it to fit what you're doing. All right, so rest pause. What is this and what is this trying to accomplish? Well, the definition of rest pause, Trex, would be if we're performing sets to failure or to a specified RIR that's really close to failure with very short rest, so 20 to 30 seconds. Now, as you said before, traditional sets are maybe 3 sets of 10, and you might take a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes rest there. But rest pause sets, you can come about this in 2 different ways. You can pick a total number of reps to do or a total number of sets. So let's give an example with a total number of reps. Let's say you set a goal of I want to do 45 total reps. Well, the way you'd utilize this is you'd pick a load, let's say on a dumbbell bench press that you think you can do for 20 reps. You might perform the first set. You do that entire set, let's say to failure. That's 20 reps. You take 20 to 30 seconds more rest. You do another set. Maybe you get 7 or 8 reps. So let's say you get 8. Now you've done 28. You take that next 20 seconds rest. Let's say you get 5 more reps. Now you're at 33. And you keep repeating that process until you get to 35, or excuse me, until you get to 45 reps. Another way to do that is you just set a set goal. So you say, I'm going to do this for a total of 7 sets. And then whatever the total number of reps you get, you get. Now, you have progressive overload built into that, even if you keep the same load. Because if you keep the same load and you say, I'm going to do 6 sets or 7 sets, well, the following week, you might get more total reps over those 7 sets. Or you might get to that 45 reps faster if you use the reps model. And so you can say, all right, this first week, it took me 7 sets to get to 45 reps. The next week, if I get there in 6 reps, then I'm going to increase the load that I'm using, right? And so it has that progressive overload built into it, and you can hit benchmarks to be able to progress with it. So what's the usage of this? When would you use it? Why would you use it? Well, it's a very, very time efficient strategy. I have a video that's out for free on the massresearchreview.com website that looks at time efficient programming strategies. And I break down exactly kind of how much time this saves you compared to traditional training when you do it. So if you're really short on time one day, you typically have an hour to train, hour and a half, but you got to go to school early, you got to go to work. Obviously, Valentine's Day, you wouldn't be going home to your spouse. You'd be coming here, so time efficiency wouldn't be an issue on that day, as we're finding out. But you might incorporate this to save some time. A way to utilize it, I probably wouldn't use it on your main lifts, skilled movements like squat, bench press all the time, just because there's such a high fatigue component, especially associated with metabolic fatigue. And so if you are performing, 6, 7 sets of squats all to failure with 20 seconds rest, the risk of a technique error becomes higher. So if you're short on time, I might do those squats or those bench presses normally. But then on the assistance movements, that's when I'd pack in some rest pause sets to probably go ahead and save some time. There's some sort of mystique a lot of times around these strategies. I don't think there's anything magical. The research doesn't tend to show on average there's a difference between traditional training and rest pause type training for strength or for muscle growth. But it doesn't necessarily show that it's worse either. The way the literature tends to look at this, though, is to compare a method or a training session of only rest pause training to only traditional training. And typically that's not how we would use it in practice for the most part. We would perform some rest pause training for some movements in a training session and perform traditional training first. You can utilize it for the whole session, but I probably wouldn't do it all the time. If you're doing it all the time, the other factor that comes into play are what I call the downstream effects, which could be, all right, I'm constantly performing all of these sets to failure with very, very short rest interval, and I'm packing in a ton of volume, but what's that doing to my session RPE? How fatigued am I from that, especially over the next few days? And so I think that might be difficult to sustain all of that, and it might be difficult to train heavy enough consistently on some of the main lifts, especially if you're training for strength. That being said, and I know Trex and I shared this because we've mentioned it to each other before, which is that I do think another practical usage of this is it can help keep people engaged and keep them focused. I know sometimes my mind would wander when I train. Maybe you sit down on the bench press, you start thinking about something, you get an email for work, you get something on your phone or whatever it might be. But if you only have 20 seconds to rest and you're doing this rest pause training, you don't really have that option. And you're staying focused. So rest pause training, using either the set or the rep model, performing some sets to failure or to an RIR very close to failure with short rest, and doing that until you hit that specified number of reps. A time-efficient strategy used to accumulate volume. Now, if we go to Myo-Reps, right, which is on the next page of our doc here, Myo-Reps is very similar to rest pause. This came about some time ago, but the difference I'd say between Myo-Reps and rest pause is really twofold, in that ultimately a lot of the sets are going to be of lower reps, and it tends to be a much more rigid thing. Whereas rest pause training, you could utilize really any load. I said pick a load for 20 RM, but you could pick a 10 RM load, you could pick a 15 RM load, you could pick a 30 RM load. It's just the concept. Myo-Reps, on the other hand, was developed as somebody developing, hey, do exactly this thing, which is essentially a rest pause strategy with more fixed repetition targets that you're going to utilize. And so Myo-Reps, the first set is what has traditionally been called a, quote, activation set. And this would be to choose a moderate to lighter load, about 20 to 30 RM, maybe 15 to 20 RM, kind of the sweet spot. And doing a set as that activation set, not to failure, with 1 or 2 reps in reserve. Now, after that, you're going to keep that same load for the entire time, the entire session, or the entire number of sets on that exercise. From there, you're going to take maybe 20 seconds rest or 3 to 5 breaths, and then perform 3 to 5 reps with that same load. Should be maybe 0 to 3, 0 to 4 RIR, something like that. And you're going to keep doing that, taking that 20 seconds rest or 3 to 5 breaths, and then performing 3 to 5 reps with that same load. Now, you could alter this slightly, although it is more rigid. Instead of saying 3 to 5, you're going to do exactly 4. And when you would stop in this case is when you can no longer maintain the number of reps that you're doing. So you can no longer maintain that 3 reps or that 4 reps, whatever you're doing. And so once you drop below that, then you go ahead and you stop what you're doing. And so that's Myo-Reps, very similar to rest pause training in that sense. But you have this a bit more rigid type of thing. One thing I'll add on there is whether you go for the 20 seconds exactly or whether you go for the 3 to 5 breaths, if you're going with the breaths, I would really kind of almost drag them out, right? Make sure you're really breathing slowly, because you're going to need that time. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and this is a pretty difficult thing to do. So ultimately, the uses in practicality, it might be targeted a little bit more at practicing the technique and strength because you're utilizing lower reps. You can hold the technique a bit better on those. You are getting a pretty good amount of volume in that short amount of time. Again, I'd probably use it in addition to traditional sets. If you're going to use it on something like a squat or a bench press, especially if you're training for strength, I might work up to like a heavy single first, like a single at a 90% of 1 RM, get your strength adaptation for that day, work up something pretty heavy, and then go ahead and do that activation set and incorporate your Myo-Reps after that. And I think that's something the literature kind of leaves out a lot in this, is we tend to look at these in isolation. We don't realize they can and probably should be integrated into a training session with other strategies. So to sum up those first two, rest pause and Myo-Reps are very, very similar, except Myo-Reps has a bit more of a rigid structure in terms of doing exactly these number of reps. So as we move on here, Trex, there's 4 more we're going to get to. The next 2 are also connected, rest redistribution and cluster sets, and this is what you alluded to in the intro. So I've put those together. But I want to pause there for a moment, now that we've covered the first 2, and see if there's anything that I went over there that you think I should clear up or you'd like me to elaborate on for the folks out there.
No, I think you did a great job with that. In hindsight, I talked last week about saying, I do some kind of redistribution of my rest. And while that is technically true, I think the way I train more closely fits the actual definition of drop set training when I'm kind of short on time or I'm kind of bored or not focused, whatever the case may be. So clarifying that point. And one other thing that I was thinking about when you were talking was I started thinking, like, when did this start in my life? Not to go on too big of a tangent, but when did I start struggling to focus and feeling like I needed to fill my rest periods with something more active? And I hate to sound like another grumpy old person. But these damn smartphones, Mike, I swear, I did not used to be this way. You know, I think back to when I was training, when I was, 15 or 18 or 21, and I didn't have a smartphone yet. It was just me and the old iPod mini or iPod shuffle, whatever the case may be.
The shuffle.
And man, it just wasn't a thing. Like, I was completely engaged, locked in, but it's these damn phones. And now I'm like, whoa, I'm sitting down for 2 minutes straight. Like, I should be checking email. I should be on Instagram. I should be doing this. So just me kind of shaking my fist at the clouds and saying, doggone it, this technology. But yeah, in terms of content, I think you nailed it, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I agree with you in that when you're doing more of rest pause almost turns into be more of a continuous exercise.
Right.
And when you do that, it's very difficult to look at your phone. As you know, I've been, for the last nearly 4 years, right, I've been doing a different style of training, and I've been running. And when you're out there and you're training for a long run, you can't be looking at your phone the whole time, right? And
Nope.
So that's one of the things I really, really like about it. You're actually out there in a way. So if you can simulate that in the gym when you're lifting in some capacity, I do think that could have that indirect benefit you're describing. So you're not sitting there. Because part of the reason too, I think, isn't that folks just, there's a lot of, people can't turn away from their phones. But I also think that, and you described this, people feel they need to be productive. So you, for example, have a lot going on. And since you have a lot going on, you feel like you need to check your email and you need to do all that kind of stuff. And so, it's hard to get away from it when you're like, oh, I know I got 4 emails. I got to get back to them. So any type of continuous exercise could help a bit to get away from that. So
yeah, I think it's a good analogy that you bring up because, sometimes I feel nervous about admitting this in front of people on the internet, but I actually really subjectively would say I enjoy running more than I enjoy the practice of lifting weights, sometimes, not always, but I go through phases where I much prefer running over lifting, and then I go through phases where the opposite is true. And yeah, I very much enjoy the continuous nature of running, and that's probably what got me, when I'm really struggling to focus or feeling a little bit bored with my training. I think that's probably why I gravitate toward a more continuous setup, as is afforded by drop sets.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Rest pause sets. Here I am messing up the terms when you're defining them so clearly.
Yeah, drop sets are going to have a similar, when we get there, ability, I think, to have that continuous exercise type of component and do some of that similar stuff. So as we get back to it, the next two, as I said, that we have on the sheet here are rest redistribution and cluster sets. And I, pun intended, clustered those together because, like rest pause and Myo-Reps, they are very similar. So we'll start with rest redistribution sets. This is a bit of a newer term in the literature, and by newer, it's still been around for some years now, but certainly much newer than something like supersets, which we'll talk about at the end here. So when we look at rest redistribution sets, essentially what this is doing is it's taking a traditional prescription and it's redistributing the rest to have shorter interset rest intervals and more sets, but fewer reps in each set. So if you take, let's say, 80% of 1RM, and I'll go over this specific example that's on the page in front of you in just a moment, and you're performing 6 reps, but now you go down to 2 reps per set at 80% of 1RM, well, hey, you're going to have a lot more repetitions in reserve. So from set to set, the velocity or the power output that you can maintain should be much better, and you won't be fatiguing as much. Well, for strength, perhaps there's an advantage of staying a bit shy of failure and maintaining that velocity. And certainly there probably is for explosivity, right, for power output. So that's really what rest redistribution sets are gained toward. So this, to be clear, is taking the same total time as traditional sets. But just as the name says, it's redistributing the rest to do that. So the example that's in front of us here is traditional sets are 3 sets of 6 at 80% of 1RM with 3-minute rest intervals. And again, this is just a conceptual example. You could take another number of sets, another number of reps, another percentage, and another rest interval. But 3 by 6 at 80% of 1RM with 3-minute rest is our example. We go to our rest redistribution model. That 3x6 becomes 9x2 at 80%, and the rest intervals become 45 seconds. Now we're taking the same amount of time, so we have shorter rests, so we're super engaged. But because we're only doing 2 reps on each set at 80%, our RIR is going to be much lower. Let's say for somebody this is about a 8, 9, 10 RM. I might even argue 11 RM for some. But if we have this at a 10 RM, somebody only does 2 reps on the first set, they might fatigue a little bit because the rest is only 45 seconds, but they're going to be able to maintain that velocity from set to set. Another way to look at this as a potential advantage for strength is that, let's say on the deadlift, for example, if somebody is doing 9 sets instead of 3, they're getting 9 chances to set up to that barbell, 9 chances to practice exactly how they're setting up on that deadlift, 9 chances to practice how they're doing their squat walkout, right? So you could argue from a technique perspective in some cases that this could be beneficial. Now, to be clear, over time, the literature does not show a difference between traditional training and rest redistribution sets for strength adaptation. And that's going to be a theme for all of these, is that the literature isn't showing for any of these training strategies a significant difference between traditional training and these programming strategies or advanced training techniques. I think that doing only these advanced training techniques all the time might be a little bit limited for some reasons that I mentioned earlier related to some of the downstream effects. Although in this case, for rest redistribution training, it's possible that those downstream effects like session RP could be a bit lower because session RP is not only a product of volume, but is a product of proximity to failure. And rest redistribution should be a bit farther from failure. So that's primarily where it's used. Probably somebody interested in strength would use rest redistribution a bit more than somebody interested in hypertrophy, especially given the recent meta-regression where going to failure may be a bit better for hypertrophy in some cases. And if you're going to perhaps have that same hypertrophy by staying far from failure, which I think can happen, you'd probably need more volume. And rest redistribution is simply doing the same volume, but redistributing it. But it takes the same time as traditional training. So as we scroll down to cluster sets are going to sound almost eerily similar in some ways to the rest redistribution sets. But there's going to be a key difference here where cluster sets are really the only strategy on here that is not time efficient. Cluster sets are actually going to take a bit more time. So rest redistribution sets, okay, performed 2 reps, took some rest, and then performed 2 more reps. But cluster sets are doing 2 different rest intervals, and I'll explain this in a moment. They're resting after 1 or 2 reps and then resting after the end of the entire set. So the purpose of cluster sets was not created, but it's really been utilized in the research a lot for team sport athletes and looking at explosivity, soccer players, hockey players, football players, things like this, to be able to maintain velocity from rep to rep and maintain power output from rep to rep much better. And so let's say we have 3 sets of 10 if we go to our example here. So the example on the sheet, 3x10 at 70% of 1RM with 2-minute rest intervals. So you can go ahead and do that, but if you're interested in power output, well, over the course of those 10 reps, that intra-set fatigue is going to be pretty high. And with cluster sets, the way somebody would do this is let's take that 1 set of 10. Now, in that 1 set of 10, somebody performs 1 or 2 reps, then they take 20 seconds rest. Then they perform 1 or 2 more reps and takes 20 seconds rest. So to give the specific example, let's say they're doing 2 reps at a time. 2 reps, 20 seconds rest, 2 reps, 20 seconds rest, 2 reps, all the way until they hit 10 reps. That is then 1 set of 10. Then after they complete those 10 reps, they take the normal interset rest of 2 minutes. Then they go and do the second set where they do 2 reps, 20 seconds rest, 2 reps, 20 seconds rest, and so forth. And they do that for those 3 sets or however many sets are programmed. Again, this is all conceptual. Now, that should maintain, or most certainly will maintain, velocity and power output from rep to rep much better than if they did all 10 of those reps consecutively in that set. But the issue here is this just isn't very time efficient. So if you are a power lifter, a bodybuilder, general trainee looking for strength adaptation, whatever you're looking at doing, you could train this way for sure, but if you had a lot of assistance movements to perform after your squat or bench press where you did this, you'd probably be in the gym for quite some time. Rest redistribution, on the other hand, is probably the better way to go for that individual, whereas cluster sets really to maximize power output, let's say for a team sport athlete that needs to go ahead and do that. Now,
Mike, are you done with cluster sets? Were you about to move on?
I was. What do you have for me?
I had a question that might be kind of related here from the live chat. Kim asked, people can extend their squat AMRAPs, their kind of max rep sets, by taking more time between reps. Is there a literature standard for squat tempo or a general best practice? So if you're doing a top set where you're saying, hey, take this weight, do as many reps as you can, obviously you can kind of cheat that in a way. I don't know if that's the correct term, but almost by utilizing something similar to what we're talking about here, where instead of just, banging out 13 reps in a row in a steady cadence, maybe you start taking a few breaths between your repetitions. So is there kind of a standard or a heuristic or guideline that you would advocate to make sure that your AMRAP testing is actually fairly repeatable in nature?
So to me, so I'm reading this here and I just want to make sure I'm getting the question correctly. So I see really two things here. People can extend their squat AMRAPs by taking more time between reps, which is absolutely the case, right? And then is there literature on standard squat tempo for 1 rep max test? And so by squat tempo, and maybe Kim can clarify, are we referring to there in terms of, let's say, the cadence, the eccentric duration, that's going to precede the concentric in that case, because we're talking about a rep max test.
My read of the question is that she was likely referring to just that, when you do the tempo, you talk about, okay, the tempo of the eccentric, the concentric, and then that rest between repetitions. Okay. I think that's what she's referring to.
So in terms of that, this is kind of something I've talked about going back some years now. So if we're on that AMRAP set, to paint everybody a picture here, I think we've all been there where, we have, 5 sets of 5 at whatever. And then on the last set, all right, it's go time, right? Turn up that music a little louder and we get after it. And let's say you're doing something really high rep even, you're at rep 8, you think you got 2 more, you go to 10, and then what happens? And anybody that's kind of listening later on especially is probably going to laugh. But then what happens? You take a couple breaths, right? You go, and then you do another rep. And then maybe the next time after that rep, you take like 5-6 more breaths. And then maybe you hold that breath and you do 2 consecutive reps. And you're like, I don't think I can do another one. Then you stand there for 10 seconds with the barbell on your back. You take another breath, and you do another rep, right? And this is where it's really difficult to know when absolute failure is coming. Got it, Kim. Thanks for the clarification. It's difficult to know when absolute failure is coming because there's so many aspects of fatigue that are in play, right? You have the neuromuscular fatigue here, you have metabolic fatigue, you have the all of the intraset fatigue, right? So this is why it's so difficult to gauge something like repetitions in reserve when you get so much higher in terms of the number of reps. So is there an exact amount of time between each rep? I wouldn't say there is on an AMRAP set an exact amount of time. I would say, let's say on a normal set of squat, if I'm looking for the exact amount of time, it's enough time to finish the repetition, let your breath out, take another one, and then get tight and go back into the squat. Stand up, let your breath out, take another one, and go back into the squat. Something like on the deadlift, you're now starting, this is a little bit different, but you're now starting with the concentric portion of the lift, meaning it's not preceded by an eccentric portion of the lift. So you're not getting the benefit of the stretch shortening cycle. Well, if you do a really hard first rep and then on the second rep of the deadlift, you bounce the weight off the floor or you just let it stop for a half a second and pick it up, you're going to get the benefit of the stretch shortening cycle. So on a deadlift, the stretch shortening cycle benefits tend to dissipate after about 4 seconds, right? So ideally on that, you could argue that you might want to take about 4 seconds when training for a pure benefit of a 1RM, of the transfer to the 1RM. And so that's a little bit of a different question. But in terms of a rep max test, it's hard because it depends on what you're trying to accomplish there. If you're just, all right, all out, I'm going to go crazy. And if you're standing with the barbell on your back for 15 seconds, is to get another rep, is that repeatable? Or are you going to be able to do that same number of reps next time? Probably not. But is it still kind of awesome? Yeah, it's pretty cool to be able to fight through that and push through all of that. So I don't know if I have kind of an exact time between reps in terms of that AMRAP set going to failure. Like if you're going to failure and you're just looking to crush it, then do whatever you need to crush it. But if you're just on a normal set of squat, bench press, enough time to let that breath out, tighten up again. If it's the bench press, make sure you're pulling that bar apart again. You're kind of putting that pressure on your pinkies a little bit. Whatever the strategy is you use, you break the bar, take that breath again, bring it down, push it back up, get set again so you can do that. And that's probably what I'd weight each time. But if it's just an all-out set to failure, go for it. Do what you need to do. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Are we ready to move on from cluster sets to what's our next one here? Supersets.
So supersets. Yeah. Supersets are something that I think over the last decade, and certainly since I started writing for Mass back in 2017, there's been some important studies on. And we've covered these in Mass a little bit, both Dr. Helms and I. And the reason, you're most welcome, Kim. The reason that I think these are important is because I think there's a really, really useful strategy here. And to get to this strategy, I want to outline first and foremost that there are 3 different types of supersets that I want to outline. Now, a superset is just doing 2 exercises back to back without taking any rest between the exercises. So, for example, doing a squat, then doing a bench press with no rest between, and then going ahead and taking that rest. This obviously is very time efficient because you're minimizing the rest that you have. You're only resting after both of those exercises. But there are ways that we can utilize supersets that are a bit smarter than other ways. So those 3 ways to utilize supersets is 1, the agonist superset, which is doing the same muscle group for each exercise. Now, textbooks will often refer to these as compound sets, but I think they're more commonly called supersets. So I'll just utilize that term here. And so this is the same muscle group. So you're doing dumbbell flies and dumbbell bench press. It's the same muscle group. Obviously, performance is going to be impaired on the second exercise. So you have 3 sets of 10. You do a set of 10 on dumbbell flies, no rest. You immediately do a set of 10 on dumbbell bench press. Then you take your 1-2 minutes rest. Then you do that superset again. Then you have the agonist peripheral superset. This is the one I already mentioned, which is, let's say, the bench press squat. These aren't agonist muscles, and they're not agonist-antagonist. They're not really related, but there could be some more peripheral fatigue if you're doing a bench press or a squat that kind of bleeds into the other one, especially with compound exercises like that. So when you look in the literature over the course of multiple sets, the velocity, let's say, from set to set on each exercise doesn't decrease too much. It's not as these types of supersets don't fatigue the other exercises nearly as much as the agonist, but it's probably not the best option. That being said, just because it's not perfect doesn't mean it's unusable. Essentially, if somebody is very limited in the number of days they can train, let's say somebody is really interested in performing high frequency 3 times per week or even 2 times per week on the main power lifts, the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift, but they can only train 3 times per week. Well, you might need to utilize some supersets here if you only have an hour to train 3 times per week on these main lifts. And so the way to do that, though, is if you're training Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you don't have to say, hey, I'm going to train squats heavy Monday and bench presses heavy Monday. You could train for power on squats on Monday and you could train hypertrophy bench presses on Monday. And you could superset those because the squats are a bit lighter and they're not going to be too affected by the bench press. So you could be a bit smarter in the way that you're going about that agonist peripheral superset. If you're trying to do, 6 sets of 3 at 90% of 1RM on squat and bench press and superset those, you're going to have some fatigue and it's probably just not going to work too well. But if you're going to utilize something like, some singles at 80% of 1RM on squat and then some heavier bench press or some hypertrophy bench press, you could probably superset those in the agonist peripheral without too much of an issue. But the champ of supersets is really the agonist antagonist superset. Now, that's when you're utilizing performing one exercise, and then the exercise that's supersetted with trains the antagonist muscle group. So the most common iteration of this in the literature is a row bench press superset. Now, this actually has been shown across all of the studies that I'm aware of to not only not impair performance on both of the exercises, but in I believe 2 cases I can think of, actually improve performance compared to a baseline of not supersetting them. So essentially, if you're doing rows and then bench press, the number of reps on the seated row, which was in the study, to failure seemed to be increased compared to not utilizing the bench press afterwards. And so this makes a little bit of sense because let's say in a traditional set, you're doing something like 3 sets to failure using whatever load on a row, and you take 2 minutes rest after that. But let's say you do supersets and you do 3 sets to failure, and then you superset that with, you do a set of row, then a set of bench press, then you take 3 minutes rest. You're actually getting longer rest in the superset because you're doing the bench press after the row and then taking the rest. But you're saving time in the total session. So it makes a little bit of sense that because of that longer rest, you might actually improve performance on that. Not all studies show that. One study also did show that in a leg curl, leg extension superset. But nonetheless, the agonist-antagonist superset is a really good time-efficient strategy, excellent way to go. You could save a lot of time on those exercises that are performed after. If you're short on time one day, say, hey, I want to maintain my strength levels and get a lot of hypertrophy. A great way to do this. Work into the gym, work up to a heavyish single on one of your main lifts, maybe do one more set, then back off of that and find a bunch of exercises that you can utilize agonist-antagonist supersets, pack in that volume, and then you should be good to go and you won't impair performance. This is one of the one strategy on here, programming strategy, that I would say is more of an all the time thing, something that you can use much more consistently than some of these others. So to me, that's really the champ of the ones that are on here.
And I'm a big fan, by the way. I love doing supersets, big time.
Yeah, it's similar to the others, right? They keep you engaged. You're going, you don't have a lot of time to sit there and play on your phone or do whatever it is that you might do, and you're not getting any performance impairment. If you just like and we kind of, in this day and age in the evidence-based fitness community, we're talking about kind of all these strategies and these outcomes, which is what we should be doing. But at the same time, you're going to get a nice pump. It's going to be fun. It's going to feel great. And we can't ever forget that part of it, because if we're here talking about this, that's probably why we got into this in the first place. And it gives you a sense that you're really working hard and putting the work in. So I'm with you, man. To me, that is one of the champ of these programming strategies. And I always love to utilize them as well.
All right. So we're going to do our final one here.
Yeah, our final one is drop sets. And for drop sets, this is another one that, as I might say about somebody famous, like if you were introducing the world's best brake pad salesman, you would say a man that needs no introduction, and then Tommy Callahan would come walking out. If I want to say, a training strategy that needs no introduction, I think it would probably be drop sets, because I think we all know about this, right? This is what we would call maybe running the rack on dumbbell curls, right? So you're performing sets with no rest and decreasing the load on each successive set. So the two examples that I have on here is that you could utilize drop sets as terms of an add-on to traditional sets, which is not really what the literature does, but what I think is done a lot in practice. And it's how I started introducing myself to them many years ago, which is you might perform 3 sets of 15 on an exercise, let's say dumbbell curls as I have on our example. And then without any rest after that, you might drop those 20 kilogram dumbbells to 15, do a set to failure, drop 2.5 more kilos, do another set to failure, 2.5 more kilos, another set to failure. So you're kind of like a finisher, finishing up a workout. You do this and you're good to go. You could do it on a main exercise. I wouldn't do it too much, but if you did, I would do traditional sets of squats and then maybe drop the load quite a bit and do 1 drop set. But the literature tends to use it as a standalone strategy, which is instead of doing those traditional sets, you're just going to start with those 20 kilo dumbbells or maybe a bit higher, and you're going to do them to failure, drop 2.5, 5 kilos, do them to failure, 2.5, 5 kilos, do them to failure. And you keep doing that until you get 4, 5, 6, 7 sets, whatever it might be, and then you move on. And similar to rest pause, it's super time efficient. And you'll kind of get everything done that you need to for those assistance movements. Again, I wouldn't do this on the main lifts due to the skill component, potential breakdown of technique, possibly opening yourself up to injury risk on some of those skilled movements. So I'd use it more on the assistance exercises. And then to kind of take everything full circle back to the front here, we talked about the difference between programming and that overarching model of periodization. And we said that periodization dictates your programming. Drop sets is a good example of this. Again, that individual interested in strength is probably going to perform drop sets earlier on in that macro cycle when volume is higher. They're not going to perform drop sets in that last week where they don't really want to accumulate that intraset fatigue just before they're going to go ahead and test strength. So that's kind of an overview of everything. That was a lot there for this episode of Office Hours, but I hope it was beneficial. I hope it helped to clarify any questions on kind of the intermingling or of these definitions from one going into the next. And lastly, I leave you with on this. I always urge everybody to understand these things conceptually. And for the most part, other than maybe some of it on Myo-Reps, not taking any of these numbers and saying, I have to do exactly this. Understanding what are drop sets trying to accomplish? What are supersets trying to accomplish? And if you understand that, you can probably find an iteration of it that's better for you than what I can explain, because you know the time constraints you have, you know what's in your training program, you know how much volume you can handle. And so hopefully that's beneficial for us.
Yeah, I thought that was great. And I can honestly say that in a typical workout right now, when I go into the gym on a regular basis, basically every workout, I am doing rest pause sets, I am doing supersets, and I'm doing drop sets. So these are strategies that aren't just kind of these random little wacky training techniques that you see in the literature, just some random study here or there. I mean, these are very practical, very useful training strategies. And those 3 for me are absolutely staples in my training. I really do love them. So I'm glad that you covered those, and hopefully people that are listening will get some ideas about how they will maybe incorporate some of this stuff. Maybe they've never thought about training that way and they say, oh, interesting, I'll try that. Or maybe they've been training that way and they didn't know there was actually a name for it or any research behind it. And on that note, I just had one follow-up question. Would you say that, as you're going through the literature on these various techniques, these 6 techniques that you reviewed here, would you say that a lot of this research has been done since 2010 or before 2010?
I'd say a lot of it on rest redistribution and cluster sets has been done since 2010. On drop sets, there was some stuff that came out before then, but I'd say more Godot came out 2005, I believe, but more of it since then. Rest redistribution and cluster sets certainly more recent. Prestes rest pause was 2013. There was another rest pause with a little bit of a different definition that was around 2007. No, press pause was 2017. So about then. So I'd say since, overwhelmingly since. I can think of a few. It's funny. There's always a few things you can think of that came out years ago, or you're looking at a topic and you've never seen a paper. All of a sudden it pops up with like 1991 and you're like, how come nobody else investigated this until 2012? Yeah. So I would say just thinking here about all these strategies, and then the supersets, there's 3 or 4 papers in mass we reviewed, and those are all recently. So I'd say overwhelmingly since 2010.
Yeah, the reason I asked was because I remember when I was thinking about college degrees for undergrad. So this would have been about 2008. I was going to different campuses and talking about different programs. And there was this one that had this honors program that was really cool. They kind of copied off some model of, I think it was Oxford over in the UK. But basically, their honors program, you could basically set up your own curriculum with some very basic guardrails. And so you could make this cool multidisciplinary degree for yourself. And there was a big research emphasis. And I was like, oh man, I'm going to go here and I'm going to study all these things that I read about in the bodybuilding magazines that no one's bothered to study. And, you know, what do I know? I'm a junior in high school. It's not like I have like, you know, a firm grasp on what's out there in PubMed. But I do, you know, really get the sense that there was around that time, in that 2008 to 2012 kind of time window, was a real shift in the literature where we started to see more of these things, more of these like practical in the trenches type strategies getting studied in a meaningful way with a decent level of frequency, which is pretty cool. And some of them still haven't been studied that much yet, but it's kind of like when we started to see these popping up. And my personal research didn't actually end up going in that direction, but I'm glad somebody was doing it, because it seemed like it's about time to put these things to the test.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I individually, really only me, changed the game of exercise science research, because 2008, when you mentioned, is the year I started doing research. So
yeah.
Obviously that's exactly what you meant, and I appreciate it. That's high praise. I wasn't going to go that far, but I appreciate you saying it.
Yeah, when I think of the literature, I think of the pre-Zourdos era and the post-Zourdos, or the current era with Zourdos. I don't want to say post-Zourdos, so that kind of implies that you're washed up, has been, basically out of the game.
I mean, my students are much better than I am at this point, so we can let them take over.
Yeah. Okay, so post-Zourdos. He's done.
That's fine with me. He's washed.
Exactly. So, okay, first of all, the hashtags are exploding in the chat. Trextopia, Zourdopamine, those are the classics. Daniel says, hi from San Francisco. Hey, back at you. Never been, but my wife has been. She says nice things. Hope you're doing well out there. Trextron is a hashtag. Fighting Zordsman, that's pretty good. Minimum effective Zourdos, another good one. You know, it's really interesting. Trext pause sets, I think that one's a stretch, but progressive Zourdo load. I'm helping them out there with a little edit. Basically, the problem is, last week we found out you and I have names that lend themselves to a variety of creative hashtags. Lauren's got nothing. Her hashtags are really falling behind, and I hate to call her out when she's not here to defend herself, but there's a growing discrepancy, a big gap.
I'm going to spend, I'm hoping you take the next question, because I'm going to have to spend that time thinking. I was listening to your episode with Lauren. I wasn't able to watch live, but I was listening to it while I was on a run, and I came up with a hashtag for her, and it was good, but now it's escaping me. So you're going to talk about something, I don't know, probably related to nutrition, something I'm not interested in, and I'm going to spend that time running that back.
Okay, well, actually, let's put a pin in that, okay? Because I did want to run a couple questions by you. Obviously, one of our top priorities with office hours is to show some love to the live chat. Okay, a couple hashtags coming in. Simple Sisters and Simple Joys in Life. They're not necessarily lifting related, but those count for sure. Okay, so there were a few questions that came up that were very training focused, and frankly, I think you can answer them considerably better than I can. So one of the ones here, where to go? Okay, yeah. Any thoughts on systemic fatigue? A lot of folks lately have been saying how CNS fatigue, or central nervous system fatigue, isn't really a big deal, but folks really never elaborate on, you know, what this is, what's driving it, and ultimately is central nervous system fatigue something that we should really be thinking about with regards to our programming?
So this is a big question, and I'm going to keep the question up here so I can make sure I have it.
And please feel free to give, very concise, brief answers. We just want to make sure that we kind of go through the chat here and address people's questions. I don't expect you to do another 45-minute deep dive or anything like that.
I was going to go 46. I had a timer on it, and I thought I could beat it. So for this question, so I love that it says in this question, but it never really elaborates on what is actually driving systemic fatigue. Meaning, the way I'm interpreting this is, a lot of people for years, I remember when I first got into lifting, you can't do this. You can't lift heavy for more than 3 weeks in a row. Then you need to deload. And that's because of CNS fatigue. And I'd always, this is one of those things where I feel like people were never ready for a follow-up question. I'd say, well, what does that mean? CNS fatigue, you just can't handle it. You need to deload. Don't worry about it. And I was never explained clearly. I wrote about this in the first volume of Mass, volume 1, issue 4 or 5, something like that.
So back in 2017, right?
Yeah. You remember that article?
No, but I remember how volumes and years work.
You could have said, yeah, of course. Yeah. I read Mass back then.
I read it at the beginning of the month every month just to kind of bring it back up to top of mind.
Yeah. It could have made me feel good. And so it was comparing central fatigue between the squat and the deadlift. And on the deadlift, it was always said the deadlift causes the most CNS fatigue, right? But there's never really any evidence to show this. And what central fatigue is really measuring is cortical impulses. Now, it's pretty difficult to measure this in the literature, especially with the non-invasive tools we have and the EMG and so forth. But they found that cortical impulses that were going here to the muscle, measuring them indirectly, weren't different between those lifts, and that any fatigue tended to come back to baseline pretty quickly. Now, that doesn't mean that central fatigue can't exist, and it probably does exist to an extent, because this was only looking at it kind of acutely. So it doesn't mean it doesn't manifest or kind of go away from baseline over the rest of the week. But for a normal training session, those cortical impulses and that fatigue doesn't seem to be different between those. Now, in terms of, let's say, what's driving systemic fatigue here, this is a very big answer. And I think part of the question is, does fatigue accumulate? Right? Is there a cumulative effect? I think it's difficult to say. There's a paper that came out some years ago questioning this, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now. And I'm not sure, right, if it does. It can, in the sense that, like, if you're always training in an under-recovered state, right, you may go from overreaching and then eventually to overtraining. You're in a caloric deficit and it's difficult to recover. And now, sure, you have some systemic fatigue. But is there a cumulative fatigue effect where, okay, I train, I take 48 hours off, I train again, I train really, really hard. I'm not fully recovered, but I'm recovered enough to train, which I think is an important question, right? I wouldn't worry about full recovery all the time, just being ready to go. Does that fatigue accumulate? I'm not sure. So the short answer on CNS fatigue is that's cortical impulses. We don't have a lot of evidence in terms of a typical training session to say that accumulates over time, so it's very difficult to answer that. But fatigue is very multifaceted. The basic definition of fatigue is any drop in motor output. Is that cumulative? Can that occur because of neuromuscular, because of metabolic, because of CNS? All of those factors play into it.
Yeah, I think you did a great job there, kind of summarizing the uncertainty in that topic. And more I'm becoming skeptical of, I'm not saying that central fatigue or central nervous system fatigue cannot accumulate with regards to lifting, but I'm increasingly of the opinion that if it can, it is probably quite atypical, probably quite rare, I would say. And I think in a lot of cases, the folks who talk about having a high load of kind of central nervous system fatigue accumulating over time, I do wonder how much of that is perhaps more staleness, kind of psychological staleness of just like, I am tired because I've been doing acutely a lot of work, right? And basically I'm not feeling it. I don't really want to get back into the gym right now and do this long training session. So I think it's not to say it's like completely in their head, but I think there's kind of a mixture of more acute indices of fatigue mixed with staleness, mixed with, perhaps, sleep is getting disrupted a little bit because of the acute workload. I don't know. I think there's a convergence of factors there, but in terms of the kind of narrative that used to predominate, which was that, there's some like level of central nervous system battery that just drains over the course of a mesocycle and gets to zero, and then you need to recharge with a deload. I think that that's getting harder and harder to defend as more evidence comes out. But that's not to say deloads have no place. But I do think it raises a lot of useful questions about when, where, and why to use deloads. And over the years, I've found that I still use deloads regularly, but I use them in very different ways than I used to. All right, so Nukesploder, first of all, has just been showering me with praise in the comments. So, of course, I appreciate that and want to acknowledge that. Also, Nukesploder had a question. There is a paper called The Anabolic Response to Protein Ingestion During Recovery from Exercise Has no upper limit in magnitude and duration in vivo in humans. So basically talking about this question indicating that a human can use up to 100 grams of protein per meal with regards to, and when we say can use it, we mean to actually meaningfully facilitate muscle growth and anabolic processes, in this case, muscle protein synthesis. So I actually covered that study in depth. I gave it a full-length review within the pages of the Mass Research Review. So if you're a Mass subscriber, you already know my thoughts on it. I'm not going to elaborate on the entire article there, but my short kind of Cliff Note summary is I think this study is an important study. I think it was done quite well, and I think it highlights something that I've kind of been alluding to for a while now within Mass, which is that some of the early perspectives on protein dose and distribution and timing throughout the day were, they were a little bit narrow in scope. They would say, oh, well, you can maximize protein synthesis with only 20 grams if you're a young, healthy individual. And due to the refractory period, you can probably only do this 3, maybe 4 times a day. And so you kind of start putting together these isolated findings about refractory periods and maximal anabolic doses. And you get to a spot where you say, well, wait a minute. If we think all that stuff is true, then theoretically you could argue, a IFBB pro bodybuilder with, 200 pounds of lean mass can maximize the anabolic response of protein by having 80, maybe 100 grams of protein per day. You start to run into these scenarios where you say, that doesn't seem right, and it doesn't really align well with the kind of literature looking at more chronic adaptations, right? So when someone only eats 80 grams of protein per day, what kind of gains do we expect from them? Not really all that great relative to someone who's having double that, right? And of course, the benefit of going higher and higher with protein plateaus, in my opinion, a lot lower than most people often say, or at least it starts to plateau a little bit lower than most people say. But all of this is to say, I think the new study helps us fill in gaps about this massive disconnect between the acute muscle protein synthesis studies and the longer term studies that actually measure hypertrophy. All of that is to say, I think you probably can make very good use of very large protein boluses, even up in the ballpark of 100 grams per meal. And I think if you wanted to maximize the muscle building benefits of protein, you can probably maximize that response, maximize your benefit in terms of strategic timing distribution by probably only having maybe 3 meals per day. I think, getting enough total protein is the highest priority. If you split that among 6 or 5 or 4 or 3 meals per day, I think you're probably going to end up basically in the same place. I think you can argue that 3 is really only marginally better than 2 meals per day, again, assuming that you're meeting your total daily protein goal. And then I think there's a much more robust base of evidence to suggest that 2 or 3 is better than 1 meal per day. Now, I'll acknowledge right now, I'm only eating 1 meal per day. I expect to be making fantastic progress with that. The question is it optimal progress? Probably not. So that's my take on the new study in short. But like I said, the long version is within the beautiful pages of the Mass Research Review, massresearchreview.com. You know the drill. Let's see here. Zourdos, there was a question that I really wanted to get to about pre-exhaustion. So would squatting a lighter than normal load after pre-exhausting my quads with leg extensions provides similar hypertrophy stimulus compared to just doing normal squats with my normal load. I can take a crack at this and let you correct me. So if we're talking about maximizing your squat strength, I would say this approach is suboptimal, most likely. If we're talking about maximizing hypertrophy, which is in the question, I think that you would do just as well with this approach, in my opinion, and perhaps you could argue maybe slightly better, not because of, I'll just get right to the point. I think you might argue that you could do slightly better if this was all the leg training you were doing, which is probably not. But you could make the argument that doing a combination of leg extensions and squats will probably give you more well-rounded hypertrophy of the quads when we're talking about the different individual elements of the quad muscle group. But assuming that you have a well-rounded lower body training program, and we're just specifically talking about this head-to-head comparison, for hypertrophy, I don't think you're going to find much of a difference at all. For strength, I think it would be disadvantageous for specifically squat strength. Zourdos, correct me. Let me know what I got wrong there.
Well, one of the great pleasures I have in life is being able to correct you. Unfortunately, you did a pretty good job here. So I'm not able to lay down the hammer and inform you that you made a drastic error. And so, as Trex said here, I fully agree that for exercise order, right, which is really how I'll frame this, exercise order matters for strength in the sense that if you, and this question was specific to hypertrophy, so I'll get to that, but exercise order matters for strength in that strength is specific. So if you want to get better at something, you should do that thing first. So for example, if you did want to increase your squat 1RM, well, if you're always squatting after leg pressing, obviously you're going to be fatigued. The training variable that's most closely related to increases in strength is going to be the load on that barbell, the percentage of 1RM that you're utilizing. And so you're not going to be able to lift as heavy if you do that second in a session. If you're looking at a neutral strength, so let's say you're training upper body and the test in the research study is hand grip strength, neutral strength, it doesn't seem to matter if you do the dumbbell bench press before the bench press or the shoulder press before the bench press. So strength is specific. So even if you wanted to maximize your strength on a shoulder press as opposed to a bench press, then you should do that first in the session. So exercise order matters for specific strength. But in terms of the literature, that's about all it matters for. So in 2021, there was a meta-analysis from Nunez, and I covered this in Mass, and I have a couple exercise order videos in the Mass Research Review, part 1 on strength, part 2 on hypertrophy. And for hypertrophy, if you look at the effects in the Nunez meta-analysis from 2 years ago, in terms of the forest plot, they are almost all right on that zero difference line. So meaning that if you're performing multi-joint exercises or single joint exercises first, or this exercise or that exercise, muscle growth tends to be similar. So the exercise order, as Trex said, really doesn't seem to affect muscle growth. There could be special cases, again, as he alluded to. If you're only utilizing 2 specific exercises, then the order could matter, but that's probably not the case. Assuming the rest of your training program is well-rounded and you're incorporating everything in, you like to perform squats first, but you get to the gym and your main goal is muscle growth, and the squat racks are occupied. They're probably not squatting, but nonetheless, the squat racks are occupied. And you got to do the leg press first, the leg extension first. Don't worry about it. No reason to, angrily throw your protein tub on the floor. You're good to go. Go ahead and do that leg extension first and then go to the squat rack. So the bottom line is, for specific strength, exercise order matters. Really, for anything else, it probably doesn't. You can make nuanced arguments here or there. Oh, I think we could do this a little bit or so forth. It probably doesn't matter. And to the original question of doing the lighter squats after, are you getting kind of the same hypertrophy? Well, if, let's say, and here's where the indirect way it could matter. If you're doing all of your leg press, your leg extensions, whatever was done first in that example, and then you're so fatigued after that when you get to the squats, you just don't feel like doing them, and you often cut the volume short, then it could matter. Not because actually doing leg extensions before squats impairs your muscle growth. But because squats take all of that effort, they're more of a compound movement. You got to put the barbell on your back. They're a bit more systemically fatiguing, and you just can't muster up the energy to do all of the volume that you would do. And if you're training with a much lower load, maybe you have to do more reps now, you're a bit more fatigued. So I think those practical considerations should always be taken into account, which is, hey, if I move squats from first to seventh in my order, I'm probably just going to have a lot less effort I can put into them at that point. Whereas if you're doing, leg curls at that point in the training session, you're still going to be able to knock them out. So physiologically, no. Practically, it could matter for those reasons.
Good stuff. All right, Mike, this is crunch time here. Rapid fire, going through the list, making sure that we are giving our cherished live viewers the attention they deserve. So I'm going to go through some of these. I'm just going to take them myself. Some of them, I'm going to kick them to you. So question, how do we assess if a certain training program is working for hypertrophy, given how slow changes in muscle size can be? I wish I had a quick, easy answer for you. It's tough. It really is tough. I think the best approach, in my opinion, is to choose at least a couple ways to monitor that work for you. None of them are going to be perfect, but they all give you some kind of information that can be useful. You can measure circumferences with a tape measure. You can focus on how your clothing is fitting. You can focus on your visual appearance in the mirror. You can also, as a very rough proxy, focus on your ability to continue maintaining progressive overload, right? So if you're adding meaningful weight to the 10 rep max for, all of your kind of incline bench and bicep curl and tricep extension, if you're progressing on your 8, 10, 12 rep maxes in those various lifts, it's not a perfect correlate or a perfect predictor of hypertrophy, but it should be, in totality, those multiple sources of information should help you figure out, broadly speaking, if you're making progress in the right direction. We've got another one here. This one, I think, I'll throw my 2 cents in and then see what you think, Mike. We could very well disagree on this. So Wes asked, what is the minimum effective dose of weekly sets per muscle group for hypertrophy in well-trained individuals? And so Wes, in other questions, had kind of asked, is there any research you've looked at? I'll be totally honest, I haven't looked at a recent view of this in the literature. Based on previous meta-analyses and, a little bit of experience and a bit of a hunch, to be totally honest, I would say when I'm trying to kind of make sure I'm doing my best for promoting hypertrophy rather than maintaining gains that have already occurred, which I would view very differently, I try to get at least 10 sets a week for a given muscle group. Could you still make hypertrophy with half of that? Probably. So I think the question is, the minimum effective dose kind of depends on, are you really looking at hypertrophy as just any positive growth or like a substantive degree of growth, right? Because for an untrained person, walking can sometimes be a hypertrophy stimulus, right? Depending on how untrained they are. For a well-trained person, I think at least 5 sets a week is going to be your bare minimum for inducing hypertrophy, would be my guess. I'd probably err more on the side of 10 sets if I'm hoping to, create a substantial stimulus for hypertrophy for someone who is quite well trained. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, this is really difficult to answer and put a number on. In the literature, there has been some talk around 4 or 5 sets per week, but we have to consider what Trex said. We're not talking about, at least the question as I'm understanding it, isn't talking about maintaining muscle size. It's talking about actual hypertrophy, which means to increase. And so at a certain point, I just don't think that person's going to continue to, let's say, increase. Strength is a different story because you could theoretically max out every single day and without doing volume. And I could make an argument that you would continue to adapt to that over time and get stronger. I'm not saying definitively or so forth, but hypertrophy is a bit different in that I don't think that's the other question of it, which is for how long, right? So could somebody that's pretty well trained perform, let's say, 4 or 5 sets per week and gain muscle for a little bit? Potentially, yes. But one of the caveats to that is knowing what we know now, and I probably wouldn't have said this a year or 2 years ago, is I probably take those sets to failure. I think that's going to matter as well, especially if you're not too worried about recovery and it's a more minimal dose. You're going to want to use all the tools in the toolbox there. And then how long are they going to be able to gain that hypertrophy? So that minimal dose probably shifts over time. That might become then the maintenance dose and how it can change. So sure, but I think it's going to be more of a moving target, where for strength, I think I'd give a little bit of a different answer.
Yeah. All right, next one. What is one lesser known or different piece of equipment you suggest people try out for fun? Examples would be landmine exercises or doing barbell exercises with an axle bar. This is a bit of a cop-out, but I actually am going to use one of the examples. I think landmine exercises are really underrated. I think landmine exercises are a very fun way to mix things up in the gym. And when I work with clients, I used to work with a lot of clients who trained out of a home gym, and they frankly did not have a ton of equipment to work with. And we could really do some interesting things by utilizing a landmine setup with a barbell. We were able to open up a new kind of, a whole new level of accessory lift that they thought would be off limits when working in a pretty bare bones home gym. So that would be my answer. And one other thing I'll mention that's not equipment, but is a technique that I think is a little bit underrated in certain pockets of the fitness world. For whatever reason, I see a lot of this being used in women who are training. I see a lot of folks using B stance alternatives for like squats and deadlifts. B stance, basically there's a few different terms you can use for it, but basically you're using, for example, for a single leg deadlift, instead of literally lifting your inactive leg off the ground and inviting all the balance challenges associated with that, you just kind of lightly leave your foot off to the side, almost like a kickstand. And you just, all it's doing there is helping out with balance. It's not really contributing to the lift at all, but it's out there, out of the way. And I've been having a lot of success lately. I've been struggling to deadlift because of some injury issues that have been going on forever. I think I might finally jump under the knife. I scheduled an appointment to go see a butcher and just say, cut me open and do what you got to do. But anyway, the B stance has been a lifesaver for me, being able to do a deadlift variation where I'm doing a B stance single leg deadlift in the belt squat machine of all things, using a handle on the belt squat and bracing with one of my hands to kind of help out with balance. So it's a really weird way to set it up. It's the only way to get to that exercise variation is to literally try everything else. So that kind of is a perfect snapshot of my desperation, is that for me to explain how I'm setting up my deadlift is like 3 sentences, right? But anyway, B stance, I've had to use it or try it out of necessity. And I think it's a little bit more useful than folks give it credit for. It doesn't really, I see a lot of folks who are in the kind of like bikini and fitness space, female trainees who are using it a lot. And I'm not seeing it much outside of that space. And I think it has broader appeal personally.
Yeah, I'll give a quick answer to this, but these are really like opposite ends of the spectrum answer. The first one is, and I started doing these years ago, I started lifting weights when I was 13 years old. And so I was in 8th grade. And then all through high school and then in the summers, what I would train for my sports season in college, we had this huge hill outside of the weight room, and just simple things that you can do. So if you have stuff at home, you can utilize these and put a barbell on her back and would do walking lunges up that hill with absurd amount of weights that were probably not good for us. But things like that, I've always just been a huge fan of, kind of finishers and to workouts. And a lot of these aren't necessarily going to be as congruent with what we're going to talk about, let's say for the evidence-based adaptations. But you know what? Sometimes you just got to get the work done. And sometimes at the end of that workout, you got to know you're crushing it, and you find a hill, put a barbell on your back. Doesn't even have to be the barbell. Do some walking lunges up that hill, and you're gonna feel awesome and miserable all at the same time. The second thing, which is maybe a bit impractical for some, but we have one of these in our lab, is a tonal. And if you've seen a tonal machine, it is really a cool piece of equipment. It can adapt the resistance for you during the movement from rep to rep without you setting the weight down. Whereas if you're auto-regulating in the gym, right, you can change the weight after the set. This can auto-regulate the weight in real time on both the eccentric and the concentric portion of the movement. It's pretty easy on the joints. I know if I had things to do all over again, I would probably do nearly all of my assistance work probably on cables, maybe a Smith machine, something like that. And using the tonal and having it in there is pretty great for a lot of reasons. So two opposite ends of the spectrum. One more new school kind of, hey, let's take it easy on the joints and kind of use this adaptive piece of equipment. The other one is my true self, which is put that barbell on your back and do some walking lunges up that hill until you can't walk anymore.
Yeah, it's tricky because I think I'm of two minds about that latter portion there, right? So like, I do think it's unfortunate that as evidence-based fitness has become a thing and there's a community built around it and there's a lot of PubMed focused battles on the internet about who is the most correct about being most optimal. I do think that lifting culture has lost some of that kind of down to earth, just do a hard thing, enjoy it. We're here for the fun. Like I think some of that is missing as part of just like the experience of a life of lifting, which is unfortunate. Like I think it's beneficial to have some of that mixed in for fun and for the camaraderie it builds with training partners and things like that. On the other hand, there's a limit, right? And it's, mark my words, every summer or two, we hear about the NCAA strength coach who's always working with a Division I football team who gives like 4 kids rhabdo because the whole purpose of the workout was just to be hard and kind of make your eyes pop when you see it on the chalkboard, right? So I don't like the latter. The former, in moderate doses, I think has a place within just the life of a lifter, right? I think you and I both started I started lifting when I was 12. You started lifting when you were 13, I think you said. When you're young, when you're 15, 16, 17, lifting with friends, like some of that stuff, you do it. And it was fun and you learned something from it. And I wouldn't go back and, wish that away and say, I wish I would have done everything purely optimally based on the evidence we have now. Not necessarily, right? Like there was something to it that was beyond just the nuts and bolts of your training. All right, we got a question here. Are there any special considerations that come to mind, either physical or psychological, regarding fitness and strength training for someone with a history of anorexia nervosa? This is a really tough one because if you have a history of anorexia nervosa and, for example, you apply to work with a strength coach online, a fitness coach, some folks will see that on an application and say, I really can't work with you because I don't have the clinical expertise to identify if we're falling back in the old habits, right? And in some cases, that's a prudent decision. In some cases, there's kind of an unintended negative consequence of that, which is that people who would greatly benefit from help with resistance training are unable to get it or really struggle to get it, right? And the only people willing to offer that help in some cases are the more irresponsible folks on the internet who say, yeah, I'll train anybody. It's all the same. Here's the PDF I send everybody else, right? So unfortunately, sometimes folks with a history of anorexia nervosa, especially if they're looking for a combination of training with some minimal nutrition support, it can be difficult to find that niche between, someone who can give me some responsible minimal nutrition support without being a full-blown dietitian doing medical nutrition therapy. So all that is to say, there are things I keep an eye on. First of all, depending on the severity and the duration of anorexia nervosa, one thing that's worth being aware of is the possibility for low bone mass and low bone density. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't lift. If anything, that means you absolutely should lift. That it's a huge reason why you should lift. But in some cases where we see very low bone density levels, we might be extra cautious about exercise selection to make sure that we're not doing things that invite an unnecessary probability of fracture risk early on, right? We might want to build up some strength and muscularity, get used to some exercises before we advance into anything that may just be a little bit reckless for somebody with very low bone density. In most cases, that probably won't be a major consideration. The things that come to mind mostly with me, first of all, if I were working with someone with a history of anorexia nervosa, I'd first and foremost want to make sure that we are not using fitness as a reframing of anorexia nervosa. Sometimes folks will say, I used to have anorexia nervosa, but now I'm a competitive physique athlete. And there was never a gap in between. Basically what happened was they continued having anorexia nervosa in terms of the actual underlying, psychological ramifications, body image fixations, things like that. Folks who are very preoccupied with their body image and perhaps have even a slightly distorted perspective of their own body image, right? Some degree of dysphoria in that regard. I have seen instances where people just continue having a lot of the pathological eating behaviors and body image concerns that they always had, but then they start lifting and say, well, no, now I'm just a competitive athlete who does physique sport. I'd be very, very conscious about making sure that that's not occurring, because you can't just paper over anorexia nervosa by adding a few pounds of muscle and saying, well, I'm glad that's not a problem anymore, because the underlying issue there is more on the like I said, some of the excessive body image concerns and things like that. And you could still be doing pathological eating behaviors and have pathological body image concerns while transitioning into something that externally maybe looks a little bit less like your classical presentation of anorexia nervosa. So I would look out for that. And then, anyone who has a history of anorexia nervosa or anything under the umbrella of disordered eating, I just like to keep an eye on it. I like to make sure that we're not kind of falling back into old habits, that I'm not seeing any red flags, anything that would make me concerned that some of those things are kind of maybe they never went away, or maybe they are starting to reemerge. And I'm very quick with the trigger whenever I see that. I like to really flag it immediately and say, if it were to happen, hey, I have a trusted dietitian who has training in this area. I want to bring them in. They're credentialed. They are trained and qualified to kind of chat with you and see, what our path forward looks like here. So I think it's good to be very proactive and cautious about making sure that you're just kind of keeping an eye out for some of those things. And I would say if you're a coach and you don't really know what keeping an eye out for those things would entail, or what you should be keeping an eye out for, in that case, I would say you probably don't want to be working with folks who have a history of anorexia nervosa. You might want to find someone that you can refer them to that you have a lot of faith in, because it's important. I always viewed it whenever there was an application and I said, I don't think it's appropriate for me or one of the coaches I employ to work with you. I always felt some degree of, I wouldn't say obligation, but I felt like it would be the right thing to do to at least be able to refer them somewhere where they could get the type of support that they're seeking. Because I don't want people in that situation. These are folks who stand to really dramatically benefit from working with a qualified coach. The challenge is finding the coach that's qualified and right for them. And I think the more we can help out as a fitness community, I think the better. Let's see here. There was a couple others I wanted to get to very briefly. I know we're going way over time here. I appreciate you for being a good sport, Mike. Let's see. There was one really good one about... I'm losing it. Oh, yeah. There was a good one here. Is it true that we have a biological set point for fat accumulation? Do you think we have a natural set point for muscle mass? I think the set point theory with regards to body fat, in its most literal interpretation, I think it has been rejected pretty soundly. I don't think anyone really still buys the idea of a singular body fat set point for a given individual. Mostly because if you read the set point theory as it's devised, literally and specifically, you find that it leaves extremely minimal, almost no room for environmental factors to really dictate an individual's body fat level. It kind of takes a purely biological view, which would mean, yes, it's hard to lose weight, but it would also mean it's kind of hard to gain weight away from your set point. And what we see in the kind of temporal trends in adiposity across a number of populations, it's just extremely incompatible with that approach, with that narrative. A much better narrative that we've written about many times in the Mass Research Review is the dual intervention point model, or dual intervention point theory. And that I've seen it written about by Speakman. I believe he developed it. If not, he's the one who's written all the really good review papers about it. So John Speakman's wrote about this at length, but the dual intervention point model suggests that there's a certain body fat level for you that's probably too low, where you start to get a lot of pushback if you try to get leaner than that. And there's a certain body fat level that's too high, where you actually have to work pretty hard to continue gaining fat because, for example, your appetite just goes to zero. And as someone who's done a lot of bulking and a lot of cutting, I've experienced both sides of that, but I can tell you it's not a single body fat level. I know a body fat level where it starts to get really hard for me to gain weight because my appetite shuts off. And then, of course, on the flip side, I think a lot of people are aware that when you try to get a little bit leaner than your body's comfortable with, you start to run into a lot of friction. So basically, the set point theory has been expanded to include a pretty broad range of body fat levels. And then the way that you move within that range, the range is set by more biological factors, but where you are within the range is more based on habit, environment, and a variety of choices related to health behaviors and diet. Now, in terms of a set point for muscle, that's kind of difficult to interpret, right? So clearly a person who never does resistance training is going to have a certain level of muscularity that is relative to their activity level. And you might say, well, they're not training. What do you mean? Well, not being bedridden is an activity level that's different than being bedridden. And when people are, unfortunately in a spot where they're, forced to stick with bed rest for months on end, even an untrained person loses a lot of muscle mass. So I think our muscle mass, I wouldn't say we have a set point in the sense that we really have a lot of plasticity, a lot of ability to adapt to the demands that we put on our body in terms of building or losing muscle. Loading really does dictate where we're at there. An interesting thing, though, about a natural set point for muscle mass is that for reasons we don't fully understand yet, I mean, there are plenty of totally plausible theories. For some reason, losing lean mass and even losing muscle mass specifically seems to lead to a disproportionate increase in hunger during weight loss, and it seems to be predictive of weight regain. So in a weird way, you could argue that maybe there's a little bit of a set point or some kind of quote unquote memory with regards to lean mass, which even extent, I think probably organ mass is more impactful in this regard, but it seems like muscle mass matters too in this. And so in that regard, I wouldn't necessarily call it a set point per se, but I think the practical ramification is not too dissimilar from what we would associate with a set point, which is that until individuals regain a significant portion or all of the lean mass or the muscle mass that was lost, that disproportionate elevation of hunger seems to persist. So it's an interesting area where, to be completely candid, we don't really know what's going on there. We think that resistance training can attenuate that effect by retaining more lean mass while dieting, but it's a really fascinating question, and I think we need to do a lot more work to figure out what exactly is going on there. And I think we'll figure it out in my lifetime. It's important to remember for context, like people talk about leptin now like it's always been a fact, like it was discovered in the 1700s. Leptin was discovered, I'm pretty sure, in the 90s. Like I was alive when leptin was discovered for the first time. And nitric oxide was discovered, nitric oxide was discovered as like something in the environment hundreds of years ago, but the fact that nitric oxide is the thing in our body that actually induces vasodilation and has all these other physiological effects, that came, I believe, in the 80s, right? So like some of this stuff, like it's kind of new, and we're continuing to discover new things that are like pretty groundbreaking and pretty foundational. I wouldn't be shocked if we discover some kind of hormone or metabolite or something of that nature that kind of helps us explain what the heck's going on with fat-free mass. I don't think it's been discovered yet, but I think it will be in my lifetime. If you're listening to the podcast and you'd like to discover it, I wish you luck and I encourage you to do that. Make my life easier. All right, Mike, I think we covered everything in the chat, or at least a huge proportion. Is there anything left in the chat that we missed that you want to cover?
No, nothing else that I want to cover. I was scrolling through, and I do think we covered a lot of it here, a good amount for this specific episode. But as always, tonight, I want to say that how much this means to us and how much we love doing it. I saw a lot of people on here tonight, saw a lot of questions, and we just appreciate it. We appreciate everybody checking in, the fact that everybody wants to come and see us and chat with us here. We love doing this, so keep these questions coming in for the next episodes, and hopefully there'll be a lot more questions we can cover next time. But thanks to everybody for being part of this and for your comments. And I appreciate being thrown into the hashtags. I'm new to the internet game, but I feel like I'm jumping right in here, so I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I want to echo what you said. Really appreciate everyone who joined us tonight on Valentine's Day. Very major sacrifice people are making to be with us when they could be elsewhere, so we appreciate that. One last question. There's just one sitting there that we forgot to hit. I have to, Mike. Very briefly. Focused on hypertrophy. You're doing an upper-lower body split. Does it matter when you do lengthened partials? Should you do it before your full range of motion work, after, or does it not matter? My very short answer, I don't think we have any evidence for this. It's too new in the literature. I would say just my personal preference. I like to do lengthened partials after, because I can usually, for example, do a full set of, full range of motion repetitions. Maybe I'll do a few sets with full range of motion. I like to use these kind of at the tail end of my final set for an exercise, just because after I do my last full range of motion repetition, I can usually do some lengthened partials before I hit failure in that regard. So I like to do them after. What do you think, Mike?
I was going to say the same thing. So if you're doing them before, the fatigue component that's probably going to come along with it is going to be quite high. And so when you then go to the other work, that work might be compromised. Whereas I think the lengthened partials, right, you're not so concerned about, let's say, performance here. You're looking at the mechanism of hypertrophy that you're hoping is coming from that. And so I kind of look at it as an exercise order thing. Doing this, strength being specific to what you're doing before and getting the benefits of doing those straight sets. But then to get the benefits of the lengthened partials, you could get it by doing it before, but it might sacrifice that other work. If you're doing it after, the lengthened partials aren't going to be sacrificed by the traditional sets. So I agree with Trex on that, and that's how I would frame it in my mind. But the major caveat to all of this is neither of us know, and we just don't know. So that's our best guess at this point. And I guess I'd leave you with that tonight, which is there's a lot we don't know, right? So a lot of the times we're interpreting and looking at things the best that we can, drawing on experience, drawing on the literature that's out there, and trying to interpret it as best possible. And so that's how I would say in terms of the order of the lengthened partials for the moment, but we do not know. Hopefully we give out a lot of master's thesis topics on office hours, and I think we just came up with another one.
Oh yeah, it's like our secondary purpose here. We're just throwing out master's thesis topics left and right. All right, Mike, I told you we'd be off here a lot earlier, so I appreciate you for being a good sport. But
no
there were just a lot of really good questions tonight, and we did hit a PR in terms of the number of folks who joined us live. One issue, which is my fault, I forgot to twist everyone's arms. The viewer to like ratio is not great tonight. So on your way out, folks, we don't ask you to drop $1 in the hat. We don't ask for much. We do ask you to just hit the little thumbs up, hit the like button on your way out. It would be greatly appreciated. The ratio, we always have to keep an eye on it. And so tonight we got a lot of viewers, which we greatly appreciate, but we need to get those likes as well. So on your way out, please do hit the like button. as always, I appreciate you for joining us tonight. I will be back in exactly 1 week on February 21st. This episode, of course, as always, is going to go out to all our podcast feeds in a few days, but you're listening right now live on YouTube. You know that's the way to get it. I will see you in exactly 1 week. I'm not sure who my co-host is going to be, but it's going to be someone from the Mass team, so you know it's going to be somebody great. Everyone have a lovely evening, and I will see you in exactly 1 week.